The fundamental building block of real-world JavaScript applications are functions. They are one of the most essential concepts in the language, and so let's study functions over the next couple of videos. So, what actually are functions? Well, in the most simple form, a function is simply a piece of code that we can reuse over and over again in our code. So it's a little bit like a variable, but for whole chunks of code. So remember, a variable holds a value, but a function can hold one or more complete lines of code. So let's now declare our very first function. So we start with the function keyword, and then we define a function name. And let's now just create a simple logger, which is a function that will simply log something to the console. So I will call this one logger, and then we need parentheses, and we will see why in a next example. And then we use the curly braces to create the so-called function body. So all the code that is within this code block here, so within this block of curly braces, is called the function body. And it's this code that will be executed when we run this function. So let's say we needed to execute a log many times somewhere in our program. So let's simply console.log, my name is Jonas. And so somewhere in our program, we needed to reuse this line of code here multiple times. And so that's why we put it in a function. Okay, so we created the function and now we can use it. And we can use it as many times as we want. So to use the function, we simply write the function name followed by parentheses, and that's actually it. And this process here of basically using the function is called invoking the function, running the function, or calling the function. So let me actually write these terms here. So calling, running, or invoking the function. And you will see me use these three terms here interchangeably. Okay, so they basically mean the same thing. You can think of them as like executing or using the function that we defined previously. Okay, and as I said, we can now use or call or run this function as many times as we want. And each time that we call the function like this, then the code that is in the function will get executed. All right, so in this case, what should we expect here? Let's see. And indeed, we get this my name is Jonas log 3 times because we called the function 3 times. And so this line of code here was executed 3 times. Great. So we just wrote our very first function and it's already working just fine. And I hope that this logic of reusing code makes sense to you. But let's now take it to the next level and really use some more functionalities of functions, because they can do a lot more than simply reusing a line of code like we did here. So usually when we write functions, we also pass data into a function. And additionally, a function can also return data as well, which means to give us data back that we can then use for something else in the program. So a function can not only reuse a piece of code like we did here, but it can also receive data and return data back. And so I like to think of functions as machines. So I think that's a great analogy. So for example, let's imagine a food processor. So we put food into the processor, then the processor does something to our food, which is the function body basically. And then in the end, the food processor returns the processed food, for example, a juice. And so that's exactly what we can do with functions as well. And actually, let's implement exactly this example. So again, we need to use the function keyword, and then we choose a function name. And just like with variable names, we should choose descriptive function names so that we know exactly what they do. So let's call this one a fruit processor. But in this function, we also specify something called parameters. And parameters are like variables that are specific only to this function. And they will get defined once we call the function. So let's give this fruit processor function two parameters, apples, and then a second one separated by a comma called oranges. And again, these two will get defined once the function is called. And they represent the input data of this function. Okay, and this will make even more sense when we then actually call this function. And let's start by logging these to the console. So apples and also oranges. And so what I'm doing here is to basically use these parameters here, so apples and oranges, just as if they were normal variables here inside this function. And now let's actually do something more interesting with these parameters. And so we want to kind of simulate that this fruit processor produces a juice out of the apples and oranges that we give it. And so let's just create a string which says that. So I'm going to create a variable called juice and then a template literal. And I'm going to say juice with, and then I'm using actually the apples parameter here. So apples, and then apples, because this apples parameter will be a number once we call this. For example, if we set apples to 3, then the string will be juice with 3 apples. And again, this will really make sense once we call this function. So oranges and oranges again. Okay, so here we build a string using the input data that we get into the function. And now comes the really cool part, because now we can use the return keyword. And with this, we can return any value from the function. And so let's actually return the juice that we just produced. And so this value that we then return can be used anywhere later in our code. So basically, this juice will become the result of executing this function. And let's actually do that. So let's call or run or invoke this function now. So fruit processor. And now we're going to specify the actual values for the parameters apples and oranges. And so let's say, for example, 5 apples and 0 oranges. Okay, and so these now will be the inputs of the fruit processor function. So you can think of these parameters here like empty spaces that we still need to fill out when we are writing the function. And when we call the function then later in the code, here at this point, we then fill these blank spaces by passing in the real specific values, which will then get assigned to the parameters. In this example, apples will become 5 and oranges, which is the second parameter here, right, will become 0. And these actual values here of the parameters are called the arguments. All right, so let's now basically run this script. And so now we get 5 and 0. So this is coming from line 26, which is this line. So it's this logging to the console of the apples, which is 5, and oranges, which is 0. And apples are 5 because that's the value that we specified here. Okay, so we specified apples as 5. And so in this function, the apple parameter, or you can think of this parameter as a variable, is now 5. And oranges is of course 0. But now you might wonder, what about the juice that we just produced here? Where is it? Well, the juice was returned from this function. So basically that means that the result of running this function here is the juice that we just returned. Basically, once this function has been executed, this code here is then replaced by the result of the function. And in this case, that's going to be the juice string that we produced. So if we want to use that value that was returned, we need to store it in a variable. So let's do that. So let's call it apple juice. And then let's log that to the console. reload it here. And now we get juice with 5 apples and 0 oranges. So let's recap again what happened here. So we called the fruit processor function here with 2 arguments, 5 and 0. And these arguments are the specific, so the actual values of the function's parameters, which are apples and oranges. And so when the function is running now, apples in here will be 5 and oranges will be 0. Then we use these values to build this juice string here, and then we return that value from the function. And what that means is that basically the result of calling this function here will be the juice value that was just returned. Okay? And then we need to save that value somewhere. We need to capture it. And we do that by basically saving it into this apple juice variable. And then we can simply log that value to the console. Of course, we could have also directly logged it to the console. So basically without capturing the value anywhere and simply logging it. So let me just copy this one here. And so if I run this now, we should see the same string twice. And yes, indeed, now the fruit processor function was executed twice, once here and once here. The only difference is that in this case here, we did not capture the value into any variable. We simply logged the result of running this function to the console directly. Okay, so just to show you the difference. Okay, and now thanks to the power of the function, we can reuse the function with different input values and then get a different output. So let's try that, and let's create a apple and orange juice. So apple, orange, juice. And so this time we can call fruit processor, let's say with 2 apples and 4 oranges. So once again, we are defining specific values here, which are the arguments, which will get passed into the function here as these parameters. So essentially what we did here was to create a very generic function that works for any number of apples and oranges. So it's really like we're leaving apples and oranges as the blank spaces. And then when we call the function, we fill in these blank spaces using our arguments. So 2 and 4 in this example. And now we can also then log the result. So apple, orange, juice. And actually we can get rid of this console.log here because we don't really need it. All we want here is to produce this juice and then return the juice from the function. Okay, and so now we get 2 juices, one with 5 apples and 0 oranges, which is this first one, and then finally the juice with 2 apples and 4 oranges. And so that's the second one that we just produced. And of course, we could run this function as many times as we wanted. But we should call it at least once, because if we never call the function, then the code that's in the function will never be executed. And that makes sense, right? So without executing the function, it's kind of useless, because the code will never run. It will never be processed, because that only happens once we call the function like this. Or like this here also. So as you see, this function here has no parameters. And so here, when we call the function, we do not specify any arguments. We could do that. So let's just pass 23. But since there are no parameters, it will not get used. And so specifying the argument here or not will not have any effect. You see that this function here also doesn't return anything, and that's not a problem at all. Not all functions need to return something, and not all functions need to accept parameters like the fruit processor that we have down here. So this is a very simple function here, and this is a more complete example showing you everything that we can do with functions. And this kind of function is actually way more usual than this simpler one here. So a function like this without parameters and without a return, we really only use when there's a block of code that we want to reuse over and over again. Once more, keep in mind that this function does not return anything. All it does is to log something to the console, but that has nothing to do with returning a value. This really only prints a message here to the developer console, but it doesn't return a value. So basically, this here does not produce a value because we don't return anything from the function. And that's why here we also don't save the result of the function to any variable, because it doesn't produce any result. Well, technically it does produce undefined, but that's not really relevant here. And so of course we don't capture that undefined value. Okay, great. And that's basically the fundamentals of functions. And I'm pretty sure that this was confusing for you if this was your first contact with functions. And actually, that's probably how it's supposed to be. So what I want you to do is to review this lecture very thoroughly and really understand how all of this works together. So how writing this generic function with the parameters works together with then calling the function with the specific values, and how the function then returns a value, and how in the end we then receive that value here and capture it into this variable. So that's what I want you to think about and to analyze. All right. So as a conclusion to this lecture, we can say that functions allow us to write more maintainable code, because with functions, we can create reusable chunks of code instead of having to manually write the same code over and over again. So that's the most important thing that you need to know about functions. And when you know that, you will know when you should actually use functions. And this is actually a very important principle for writing clean code that is used in programming all the time. And this principle is called don't repeat yourself, or dry. So we say that we should keep our code dry, which means that we should not repeat ourselves. And so functions are perfect for implementing dry code, because they are reusable code blocks that together make up our applications. And of course, we will use functions throughout the rest of the course because, as I said in the beginning, they are a fundamental building block of JavaScript programs. Oh, and by the way, you can now understand that console.log here is actually also just a function, but a built-in function that we do not have to write ourselves. But you see that we just call it like our own functions. So we call it using the parentheses here, and then we pass in a value. So apple orange juice. And the result of calling the function is simply this message then appearing in the developer console. And the same is true for the function that we used to convert a string to a number. So this is another built-in function that takes this 23 string in this case as a parameter. So we pass this argument into the function, and this function will then be executed and return the string as a number. And then we can save that like we did before. Okay, so this is going to work just the same. Oh, and of course we cannot see it, but we can still check it out by writing num. Okay, but now anyway, I will leave you to really analyze how all of this logic here works that we just wrote. So do that now, and only once you fully understand how this example works, move on to the next video.